All right.
We're live.
Hello, everybody. Yes, we're live. My name is Johnell. I go by Nell. I'm one of the I'm going to be your moderator today for this panel called "Building," as titled "Building Beyond Europe: Adapting Vaesen for Different Settings," to go along with the theme we have here called "Building Bridges." So, let's go with introductions. I'm going to go from where I see you all. Let's go from my left. CJ, introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name is Christian, better known as CJ. I have a degree in law, but today I'm in my function as a happy, interested in everything historical, Wesen, and cultural. I'm coming from Denmark, and by our kingdom's relations to Greenland, I have an interest in their uh, law and folklore and everything around it.
Awesome. Next to you, Christian. Hopefully I pronounced this right. Cussa, Iche? Or how would you want to be addressed as?
Yeah, it's Cussa, no worries. Hello, everybody. So I'm Cussa. I work as a developer, doing things for mobile game company as a day job, as a side job and night job. I create things for Foundry too, converting some books and create some systems for Foundry. Um, and I'm originally from Brazil, so basically there is some kind of very interesting folkloric and this kind of things there that we can discuss today too. And I hope you enjoy.
Thank you, Kusa. And next is Dila. I'm going to mispronounce your name.
My name is Stephen,
Stephen.
and
Okay.
my imprint is Delapore Media, and so that's my website. That's where you can find me. That's my blog, where I discuss a variety of TTRPG topics, mostly centered around horror TTRPGs, and creating verisimilitude in horror is kind of what I focus on there. I am starting my career as a freelancer. You'll probably see a little bit of stuff from me in the upcoming the upcoming Cult Kickstarter, and yeah, I'm also a folklore PhD, and so I'm here to largely talk about folklore, and I'm particularly excited to talk about the folklore of Newfoundland today, which is kind of my second home. It's where I live now and where I did my PhD. I also have my new product I'm hawking called Somebody Think of the Children. It's a Call of Cthulhu product where you play mothers facing down the mythos in order to save local teenagers. And that's me.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephen. That's awesome. And last but certainly not least, Asher.
Hey, I'm Lucas. My imprint is Veritas Tabletop. That's where you can find me on my blog and social media handles and such. My day job, I'm a public school history teacher, high school history teacher. And my side gig is writing stuff and publishing stuff for various TTRPGs and talking about integrating history and folklore into various systems and using that to kind of create more real world inspired RPG world.
Awesome. And a little bit about myself. Nell, your moderator. I'm also an artist on Physine, working with both David and Thomas. I'm also, in addition to being a freelance artist, I'm mostly like a folklore enthusiast or storyteller enthusiast. I like breaking down various stories of both myth, folklore, whichever. So, with further ado, and that's awesome. Like many various backgrounds. The question I will pose today, first off, is when adapting Vaesen in different settings, that are outside the core rulebook and the current supplement, UK and Ireland. What are the steps for a GM to take to adapt Vaesen in those set outside settings? What are your tips and tricks in regards to doing that?
Yeah, I'll start. The first is to do some research to understand where do you need this Vaesen to be, and then go lay a foundation for what kind of Vaesen will will be obvious in this kind of environment, and then slowly but steady find what kind of Vaesen suits what you need, and then make the stat blocks and make it playable is the final leg.
Awesome. Anyone else would like to addition or reiterate what has Christian said?
Yeah, I think one of the starting points for me is always starting with reading and trying to just get inspiration. There's a lot of really good academia about folklore, and so when you are starting to look at a region um, for inspiration, I think reading it kind of broadly and trying to get some exposure, particularly if it's not like the culture you were raised in, and so something you might have less of a existing foundation. Reading kind of widely is a good way to pick up what people are talking about, in terms of what the folklore is for a region.
Hmm.
Since we're talking about maybe folklore and academia a little bit, I would add in folklore, you have your secondary resources, your academic books, your academic works. You also have the primary sources. You have the actual storytellers. You have the actual people who are transmitting this culture between generations. I mean, the advantage of the internet now is that you can find storytellers on YouTube. You can find people sharing their culture in lots of different ways. And I would say go to some of those primary voices, especially if it's something unfamiliar to you. You may find that, well, what you might read in a secondary source may seem interesting, but if you actually hear the primary source discuss it, they may discuss it in a different way, or what is taken very seriously by a folklorist might actually be a joke to locals who pass it around amongst themselves.
Just write some small bits. One of the first things, of course, that the primary setting for Vaesen is on the 19th century, and before even maybe trying to take a look about the folkloric and things that you're trying to bring, especially if you're not taking the defined settings that we have, there is basically the Scandinavia and British and Ireland. Another thing that you can check is the local history for the region that you want to put on your game for that age, because probably just the stories that we'll have from that age will be bringing some kind of very interesting kind of stories and even folkloric myths that you can start to get some things about the place itself. And of course, as everybody said, basically that's still a kind of research. So what CJ mentioned, but my point is that you can even look where you want to put your setting and bringing that kind of idea, the things that happen on that time or on the time that you want to put your game on that region, to try to bring even more things to your players, especially if you're trying to do that for players from a specific region. So, for example, if you're playing with people that are living, I don't know, in France, maybe bringing some ideas about what happened in France on that age and trying to bring that myth could bring in things much more closer to the players than Scandinavia, that maybe is not exactly something that they are used or have knowledge about that.
Yeah, that's right. And how about because I love research personally, but imagine for a new GM, for instance, that can be quite all this information that we have available to us can be overwhelming. Um, how would they like? What tips would you suggest to a new GM or a GM who wants to start creating a scenario set in different settings? um, what would be the best way to start? And perhaps this will be a good segue to because you all have different expertise when it comes to different regions of folklore. Folklore in different regions. And actually, I never heard of, let's say, because you are, Stephen, you are in Newfoundland, right? Current-
Newfoundland
Yeah,
is how we pronounce it. Yeah, Newfoundland.
Newfoundland. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah. Um, let's say that I'm a new GM. I want to see Newfoundland is an interesting area to adapt a Vaesen scenario.
Mhm.
Where would I start? Where would I look in
Okay.
regards to that?
Well, if you weren't keen to immediately look at like historical societies, or if you weren't like academic resources, I mean, the first place I might point you to would be tourism websites. Honestly, I mean that's a good place to kind of get a baseline introduction to to a, a a new spot, is to look at the cultural tourism associated. Because I mean, cultural tourism is going to, for a particular place, it's going to talk about history, it's going to talk about folklore, it's going to talk about kind of culture and location, and I mean, definitely it's going to present that world in a particular light, because I mean, for tourists, you want to bring people in, so you're kind of selling or marketing the location. But I think that's a good step in the right direction. Once you've maybe looked, I mean, if you're looking to do research from there, you might check out historical societies or folklore societies that are in the area. A lot of smaller locations. I mean, I would say in North America, you can most towns in North America have some sort of historical society, and a lot of these have websites, or you might find a town nearby that that can work for you, that has a historical society page, has some photos up, maybe shows you a little bit about what life was like a century or so ago. Because I mean, in the 19th century, the first cameras were available. You start to see photographic evidence. People were taking lots of pictures of what life was like in the in the 19th century. They were very kind of stilted pictures, but you do get something from that. You can also usually find, I mean, I think about it, I run across Facebook pages periodically that involve the folklore of a particular location, or you'll find posts that relate to particular locations. You can use those to dig from there. And then if you're feeling brave at that point and kind of have a baseline knowledge, and you're kind of coming from an outside academic perspective, then you can maybe hit the academic societies. You can look up, I mean, for example, I mean, the local university here in St. John's has something called the Center for Newfoundland Studies. They have a web page. They have a small library with a lot of materials online. You can find things, for example, these aren't a universal, I would say, but I mean, some things that are kind of cool to pick up out of um, these kind of resources would be insurance maps. You can usually find insurance maps that date back to the 1890s, maybe a little bit before, depending on where you're looking. Newfoundland's kind of an odd case, or St. John's in Newfoundland is kind of an odd case in that the town burnt down in 1897, but it happens. So you, yeah, I would say those would be kind of my steps. Would be start with tourism, work your way into historical societies, and then, you know, if you're feeling like you need more, there's those academic resources. Hope
anyone
that
else would
helps.
like? Yeah, and that could be because with my experience when it comes to researching folklore, sometimes there's a lot of blank spaces. For instance, a lot of gaps. I think
Mhm.
of folklore as like a big telephone game
Mhm.
because things are going to be translated and translated. So I guess and that's a hurdle, right, for many people who are making scenarios in Vaesen.
Mhm.
Like, how would one how would one like counteract that? Because of course we do, especially for those who love Vaesen, of course the history. Um, we do have some liberty on how we want to fit, perhaps, whatever folklore we're inspired by. Um, that sort of thing. What like I think I'm trying to say is, I'm sorry. Mm. It's just a matter of there's lots of things that, like, because folklore contradicts itself a lot. How
Mhm.
how would one even counteract that, for instance? Because that's quite the difficulty that I see, that perhaps many people want to make their own scenarios. That could be kind of a roadblock that they find.
I think
Yeah.
that's one of the beautiful things about folklore when you're adapting it for a role playing game is that it is often self contradictory and it often has a bunch of different varieties, and that is something that you get to play with, right? It means that your version of a story or of a creature is one interpretation of many, and that is a valid interpretation in the same way that um, there is a like you don't have to exactly align with some sort of objective reality, because that's not how the folklore works. Um, so I think it feels like a barrier, and it's something that is like a mental block that you want to put past and say, it's better to engage meaningfully with all of these different variations and pick one that really appeals to you, or take parts of multiple that appeal to you.
And and a fact we talked about earlier is when uh, we were talking about adapting real history into Vaesen. Um, we were talking about a lot of Vaesen have cousins, have similarities with other Vaesens from around the world. So even though you don't know the total lore about a Vaesen from Greenland or Newfoundland or every, you probably have something in your baggage you can use to make something up if you can't find the information you're looking for.
Yeah. Uh, I just want to add one thing here because your question started as, oh, if I was a new starter GM and trying to adapt to something, and there are a lot of blank spaces there, how I what I could do. So I think that question is very interesting because for a new GM, this is the perfect spot to be. You just take whatever you think that is cool and stick to it. Or even if you change your mind on the middle of the game, there is no problem at all. I think that the cool thing about when you are working with something that is a myth, a folkloric thing, is that there is not exactly right or wrong. There is nothing set in stone. Um, as I mentioned yesterday on the panel from yesterday, most games encourages the GM to change the things from the game, from the book. And at some perspective, this could be even true for this kind of thing. If you find a folkloric story that says that, I don't know, that creature is vulnerable to a silver bullet, and yeah, maybe that makes sense in some region, but not here. There is no silver here, so that's not what he's uh, vulnerable for. So you are the blank spaces that it leaves is even something that the GM can build up and create his own things if he wants. That there is nothing that blocks you to even create new things. You know that you think that it will be cool and your players will have fun with that. Go for it.
Yeah, you definitely don't want these. You don't want these creatures getting in the way of telling a good story. I mean that's the if you need a creature to do something in order to make your story work, that's fine. Because ultimately, I mean, these things are these Vaesen supernatural creatures are they are concealed from our world, and maybe our stories aren't exactly accurate. You know, does a vampire drain your breath? Does it suck your blood? Does it tap you and does it touch you and remove your soul with a touch? Who's to say? All these things could be correct. It just depends on what you need in the moment. You know, borrow, steal, chop, and screw. That's yeah. It's perfectly reasonable to do something like that with folklore.
Yeah, as the saying goes, steal like an artist.
Yeah.
Just create. Just see. Like I like that. Like if you see something cool, and you can use it as a base and create something of your own. So because we have people who are in whose interests lie in different areas of folklore, regions of folklore. Christian, is there a folkloric creature from Greenland that you would like to be adapted into? Like, or what would be the steps to? Or what is the coolest folkloric creature you can think of when it comes from Greenland?
The- yeah, the problem with the Greenlandic is I don't have the nerve to try to butcher the names because the Greenlandic language is very different from anything I know. But the common thing about Greenlandic is they are very spiritual. It is very spirits and ancestors who pull in the threads. One of my favorites is a little helping fire spirit who is in a anorak, a full body a suit with big red face, and I don't think it's necessary have to be in Greenland. You find them. It could just as well be a fire shaman in a German wood or something where you could run into small helping fire spirits, help kindling the fire. That would be somewhere I could see them fit in. There are also 100-meter high spirit giants who eat from the sky. Those are a little bit more difficult to fit in a setting, but uh, if you can fit in normal giants, you can fit in spirit giants.
Yeah, is there anyone who has like who can think of a folkloric creature that's similar to that? Because there was a mention of folkloric creatures have cousins or even variants. I'm trying to think of like a helpful
Uh,
elemental. That's the only thing I can think
yeah,
of.
when I was looking up, the first thought I got was the Japanese folklore, which is, to my knowledge, I'm not an expert in it, but to my knowledge, yokai is also very spiritual creatures who can either be helpful or uh, destroying. So I believe there is some kind of parallel between those two folklores.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, let's see, and also like feel free if there's any like because I don't know the folklore that you all know or even the audience. Feel free to like discuss about which creatures perhaps would be pretty cool to see in Vaesen, or you can think
Well,
of one.
if yeah, if I was going to adapt anything from Newfoundland, I'd be remiss if I didn't start with the old hag. I think that's probably that is definitely a quintessential piece of Newfoundland horror lore. The Old Hag is Newfoundland's personification of night terrors. This is the creature that comes and chokes you in the middle of the night when you can't move. And there's lots of different renditions of it. They talk about it as the Old Hag, a being. They talk about it as a verb, being hagged. It can have an origin in magic. It can have an origin in fairy lore. It can have an origin as a ghost. It's a very versatile piece of folklore, and it's been traded around for many years. For whatever reason, there is an abundance of sleep paralysis issues in the population here, or in the traditional kind of colonial population here. I can't speak to where it necessarily comes from, but sleep paralysis is a big deal, and such a big deal that the Old Hag is the way of explaining it. And so it could be a curse, it could be an actual witch who's a hag who's doing it to you, it could be, a ghost who's dissatisfied with you, maybe you moved into their house, could be fairies who are upset with you. But I think like that would be the piece that I would make use of, as if I wanted to talk about kind of quintessential Newfoundland folklore in Vaesen.
It was just on the idea of cousins. To that, there's a South African Bantu like goblin-esque creature called the Tokoloshi, which is their sleep paralysis, and also people who die. A common cause of death in the Bantu people would be suffocation from having a fire in underneath a tent. And so it was seen as a thing that would come into your tent and suffocate you during the night. So it seems like a similar parallel there.
It's interesting to look about this kind of cousin things, because even though in Brazil that it's a quite far away, we have something similar. It's even interesting because on Brazil they are doing right now a translation for Vaesen. It's being published this year, and one of the stretch goals that they did for the crowdfunding there was to create some local folkloric creatures as Vaesen, monsters or enemies, or Vaesen's Vaesen. So we have one that is called the Cussa. Basically, the name comes from a very old word in Portuguese that is basically means a cruel or skull, and it's quite of interesting that they are putting that as a kind of old hag that comes during the night to try to steal child that does not behave correctly and this kind of thing. And it's very interesting that we have even a song that we sing for the children saying that they have to sleep, because when they go to sleep the cuckoo came to take them because their mother went to buy things on the store, and the father went to work, and there is a big question is about who is singing the song because nobody knows. So on this crazy thing about witches and these kind of creatures, it's almost seems that people were adapting as these things go. So as you said, the telephone.
I think that the idea of the telephone is particularly interesting in a lot of America's regions because of the history of colonization and imperialism. The way that European mythologies and folklore made their way into North and South America, and people bring their Vaesen with them essentially.
Uh, as you touch that, I'll just kind of put something that it's quite interesting when you are studying, looking for, especially on the South America. I cannot it's not specialist because I cannot say about Central America and North America. But on the South America, there are a lot of, for example, folkloric myths that we have that even sometimes they looks at kind of excuses for people to try to get back on the people that colonized us. You know, for example, on Brazil, for example, we had a kind of very big story about slavery, and there are several folkloric myths that we have that it's kind of almost to say something like, oh no, it was not me that kind of destroyed the crops, it was the Saci Pererê. That is one of the myths that we have, you know, that, oh, you probably did something wrong and he kind of get mad at you and he destroyed the crops, it was not us, you know. So it's even interesting that, as you said, you know, the kind of story and what happened on the place can kind of create and construct some new ideas about the folkloric that you have there. So that's why I said that when you're trying to adapt, maybe looking just to the story can kind of explain how these myths were created, or even you get some ideas how you can create your own myths to bring to your setting.
Yeah, I mean, because it's just when I go back to the old hag that you mentioned, Stephen. Now I'm reminded of and also almost vampire, and also there is even a connection with vampiric like creatures.
Okay.
I was reminded of the boo hag. You know, the swamp hag. That kind of, it's something about removing his skin, removing her own skin. She takes the breath out of people in the middle of the night, and especially there are some stories where she puts her weight on you, and then when she doesn't necessarily, in some stories, does not kill her victims. Sometimes she does, but it leaves the victims tired,
Yeah.
fatigued. Yeah, and it's interesting how you mentioned like sleep paralysis, because that's of course universal, and yet many people
Yeah.
has used tried to explain that with folklore. It is
Yeah,
quite
no, it
fascinating.
definitely there's a book called, oh, I was showing it, The Terror That Comes in the Night. It's a folklore book by David Hufford that specifically explores the Newfoundland, kind of the old hag, but also discusses the biology of sleep paralysis and kind of where this comes from. And yeah, no, it's a fascinating um, it's a fascinating weaving of horror and biology and culture of, you know, myth making.
Yeah.
I
It's
was oh,
oh, go ahead, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was actually going to remark on something that Kusa had mentioned, if you don't mind. Just the idea that I would think that were I to do it, I would want to be very careful with how I do it, and I wouldn't play so fast and loose with things. Um, but the idea that you have, I think it's unique because once you get outside of Europe, since we're talking about kind of leaving Europe, the idea that you can have colonial people bringing their Vaesen into a new part of the world, and those Vaesen conflicting with the supernatural creatures that are already present, I think kind of presents it's one of those things that intrigues me about taking Vaesen outside of Europe. I'd want to pursue it very carefully, but I think that's one of kind of those it's sort of a unique opportunity that we have in exploring outside of the more traditional settings for folk horror.
A good example about exactly what you are saying, if you look, is the book from New Gaiman, American Gods. That's exactly
Hmm.
kind of the whole perspective of the book. That is basically people going from one place to another, and
Mhm.
bringing their own gods with them. So these, what you're saying, it's very clear for me. For example, again, we had, for example, werewolves in Brazil, on
Mhm.
our folkloric thing, and it's even interesting that it's so internalized for us that we not normally people are not even thinking that, yeah, that kind of idea came from Europe. How it's so in our roots right now that we are not even thinking that it's not something that started probably there. But there is, of course, that you as a GM, you can for sure do these kind of things, and these can even bring some kind of a new surprise to players, as basically they will have no idea about what they are really for real. They have no idea about what they are, dealing with, or even it can be kind of a mistaken. They think that they are dealing with something, but it's a totally new Vaesen because it just seems there is a cousin. It's not an old hag, is a Cuca that someone came from Brazil, and you know something like that. So there is even this kind of um, playful
Oh, yeah.
things that you can do as a GM.
And that's actually a reasonable thing. There was shipping. I mean, St. John's and is Newfoundland and Brazil are both places where you get a lot of ships in and out. I mean, who's to say that you wouldn't end up with a Portuguese sailor taking a Cuca up to Newfoundland, and who's to say you wouldn't have a Newfoundland sailor taking a an old hag down south? Kind of interesting. What could happen? How could they change?
And if you
They,
want to go even further, you can put both Vasens kind of competing with each other. You
yeah.
can go crazy. They are similar, but they are different at the same time, and they are maybe having different ways of approaching of things. So it can go very wild if you want to bring these kind of new ideas to your game.
I think
Yeah,
on that idea of outside of Europe, the way that the history of imperialism and colonization and immigration more generally, and the way that that has influenced American folklore, um, also really relate nicely to just the basic premise of Vaesen, which is that you're in a period, you're in a historical moment of immense social change.
Hmm.
In the traditional mythic North, that's industrialization, but there's no reason that that can't be any other period of rapid social change. And seeing how uh, the basin that have been either are indigenous to the region or just are people who were in a prior wave of immigration, those basin coming into conflict with newer basin, um, I think that's absolutely in the theming of the system, which is a I think something that the system lends itself to, like that the basic setting of the system lends itself to.
I think I have a good example for uh, a European folklore going abroad and then coming back again and mixing all around. Santa Claus. Santa Claus started as a myth in Holland, Netherlands, as Sinterklaas. Then he went to the United States and became Santa Claus, changed his colors, changed his behavior, and then we have
Got a job with Coca-Cola.
yeah, and then he went back again to Europe and mixed up with the Danish in Denmark. He was mixed and modeled together with the Danish Nisse. So there is actually Danes today that have hard to discern why is a Nisse not Santa Claus and why is Santa Claus not a Nisse. Because those two myths have in Denmark somewhat been mixed together again, and that then again he will go abroad again, and he will mix up even more. Uh, like I know, I think in Brazil, the Santa Claus is in silk. His outfits he have a silk outfit on. So
Which does not make any sense because
yeah,
it's hot as hell there.
Yeah,
on Christmas.
but
Does
yeah,
not make any sense.
yeah,
You don't
but
have.
but that's just an example of an Vaesen who have started as a bishop in now Turkey and have moved around the world and now look nothing like a Turkish minister.
And if you say about Santa Claus, just remember that we have even a kind of a little bit more story about that, because Santa Claus, in theory, uh, it was kind of accompanied by Krampus, that it was kind of the demon that was going there to punish the kids that did not behave. That at some point probably somebody thought, okay, let's kill this Vaesen because maybe that's not the best things to tell our children. And then people just remember now, at least in most places, the Santa Claus. But it's interesting that in some regions of Europe, you have something like 20 days before Christmas, you still have some kind of celebration where people are kind of dressing themselves as Krampus and going on the streets and hitting them with some I don't some kind of stick, because they did if they are not behaving correctly and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I actually I actually attended a seminar on Krampus, and sometimes it's a gang of Krampuses like going into the children, going to the houses and hit the children with the switches. It could be quite chaotic. In some places in Europe, they do that now, but now, of course, we're talking about, as you said, Christian. Like Santa Claus is a very good example because you just see these mixing of beliefs. Because what Basin is really is they exist because of the power of belief, and
Yeah.
those and it changes over time, and we see that. And of
Mm.
course, in this time period, there's industrialization, and of course, lots of people traveling and taking their beliefs with them, and that causes the basin to travel with them as well, which is quite fascinating. And this game does allow the GM with lots of creativity, and who knows that when those beliefs mix together, maybe perhaps a new Vaesen pops up in that time as well. For instance, it's just very fascinating. Um, but let me see here. It's and we all have played a Vaesen. There's also the matter of, because how, when it comes to quotation mark balancing, um, sometimes when you're creating a Vaesen, in those settings, you have to think about you have to omit some things. For instance, and of course, in the core rulebook, they have like generic like stat blocks. What happens if you attack a Vaesen? Secret. And of course, some Vaesen can be quite powerful if, unfortunately, the party decides to attack that said Vaesen. It doesn't really go very well. Um, do you see like, and of course, what you said is that just lots of creativity in there. When, let's say that the party encounters a Vaesen, is it better to have those quotation marks that blocks set, or you're just going to narratively play the Vaesen out and go what you see fit when it comes to the party encountering that Vaesen in this new setting, since there's not really a set rules for this Vaesen, since we're basically homebrewing it.
I think that depends on your goal, right? I think that if you and your individual DM style, right? If you are a GM who plays very loose and narratively, it's fine to not have super detailed stat block. If you're a GM who wants to edge more towards more mechanical resolution, you absolutely should probably stat that up, but that's kind of an individual GM decision. I think if you're trying to publish, you probably should write up a stat block, because that is then something that's going to be intended for other people to be able to run it, and so providing more scaffolds, more guidance for other GMs to know what is the mythology of this creature, what are the powers that are normally associated with it. All of that stuff can be communicated well through the stat block structure.
I really appreciate it when publications give me stat blocks. It gives me something to ignore.
Ah,
But in all seriousness, though, I am kind of telling on myself. But yeah, I fudge things. It's a game. If it works for the story, fudge it. I mean, I've been fudging things since I was playing Dungeons and Dragons in 4th grade, and the guys went to the wrong room, so I moved the treasure there. Just to make sure that it ended. I think it's entirely reasonable in a narrative game to you can have a stat block, and I mean I even stat block things that then I ignore my own stat blocks. A stat block is a set of ideas to work with, but you will run into situations where those ideas don't work and you need something else. Have them, but they don't need to be they don't need to be like your guiding light necessarily.
But I see the good in a stat block, even though you are winging it, is next time you come back and want to play this, it can be it's years since you played this scenario last, and have all forgotten what was the thought behind this version. And
Mhm.
but you still remember it was a good version, but I can't remember why. Then a stat block and as a few words about how it works can be it can help you get back to the nice thing, to the good piece of meat.
Everybody said everything. They don't have anything to add. Yeah, create, create at least some bullet list about the things. If you think that there will not be a combat, if it will be a combat, it's a Vaesen. Just throw more than 10 dice and smile to your players and say, yeah, you should not have done that.
yeah, yeah. There's always, and of course, we're dealing with new Vaesen, especially with these beliefs morphing together. Maybe that worked with this one Vaesen, but this thing didn't work with the other. And this actually reminds because there's this universal Vaesen, the vampire, the vampiric creatures, which is quite fascinating in its own right. I recall that I ran, I think I ran a scenario for you, Christian, where it involved a vampiric base in the
Yep,
Jiangshi.
yep, yep,
Yep.
yep, yep, yep.
And which,
I still have a limb from that.
oh, which unfortunately, a priest with holy water, it won't a cross that won't do anything. But it's just when it comes to adapting base, and there's always a lot of interesting things that you can do with them. Um, hmm. I'm just
Since you
curious
did say the
on,
magic word vampire, I always
yeah.
bring this book up whenever anybody mentions vampires. It's just the best book out there as far as I'm concerned. It is kind of hard to get a hold of, but you can get a hold of it on ABE Books, like a used copy these days.
Uh huh.
It's called Vampires, Burial, and Death. It's by Paul Barber,
Okay.
and it is a well one of the more thorough academic texts I've ever seen regarding vampires,
Hmm.
and absolutely fascinating book on the subject. Just thought I'd throw that out because before we moved on, because you
Oh.
mentioned the magic word.
And there's even with the myths of vampires and werewolves, even if you look even more back, they kind of meld together. And now over time, they became more separate. And of course, with the evolution of the pop culture, basically, of course, ran with some certain things, sort of things that didn't even exist in folklore, but they just add something new because, as you said, it's create something where as create a Vaesen, or in this case create a creature where as long as it's all about creating a good story, and that's it. It doesn't really matter if some some of the folklore or some of the facts about your creature is a bit derivative from the folklore source itself. Um, and this is something I do run into because there's also the topic of adapting folklore when it comes to from indigenous people, and that's quite and indigenous or the natives.
Okay.
Yeah, excuse me, because of course we want to, because we're all enthusiasts, we all love folklore, but of course we want to treat it with respect, uh, and there needs to be nuance. Um, how would you go about that? Because I personally did do a scenario that uses Native American folklore, and of course I did my due diligence to make sure that it does not, of course, it's not insensitive. So there's a matter of that, especially when we're talking about um, colonialism, going coming from one country to the other, and of course, you know the whole story when it comes to that. So how does one I guess deal with that, especially when we all want to tell good stories, but at the same time be respectful, especially when we're using indigenous or native folklore.
To be honest, mm, I wouldn't dare to play with uh, known Greenlandic Vaesen with Greenlandic people, because even though I do my due diligence and look up every source I can, it is so scarce information about it. It would be playing with fire, and I wouldn't be able to double check anything.
Hmm. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think one of the key things is uh, making sure that you're doing it sensitively, right? Like that you are listening to the people who these stories belong to. I know with Native Americans, particularly, there are certain uh, folkloric creatures that many different uh, First Nations uh, people have said like this is our thing, and it has a lot of importance to our society. Like don't depict it, right? Don't come in and do it wrong. You're going to miss the nuance and the point. And I think when people say that, we should listen and not adapt those stories. There are other stories that uh with a sensitivity reader and with trying to get the input that you can from as we talked about earlier in this panel, getting those primary sources, getting people who are talking about the story themselves and sharing that story publicly, whether that's online and YouTube and TikTok and everything. If you can hear uh, those stories, like trying your best to recreate it faithfully and recreate uh, any important pieces of context for that story. Um, I think both of those are critical aspects to doing it with sensitivity. But all of that basically boils down to listen to the people who the folk stories belong to. And if they say don't adapt this one, but that one's fair game, then respect that and listen to that.
Um, just to touch up the Greenlandics, if I had to, I would pick and choose from different kind of Vaesen and make up my own spirit. So I was sure not to touch any specific creatures or Vaesen I didn't know. So because it is so spirit heavy, will offend anybody by making up an unknown one.
I think it's important to not freeze in the moment when you're dealing with something like this, because I mean, I think there is a tendency to kind of to want to move away, and you might think, okay, yes, I'm giving this cultural group their space, and it's important that I not, adapt what they're doing into a game, into a fantasy, into something that's for entertainment purposes. Um, I mean, I'll reiterate the idea that, yeah, I think going to primary sources is essential. I think the idea, I mean, especially if you're publishing something, I think having a sensitivity reader at this stage is essential. And yeah, listening to folks, and if folks indicate that this is not something that they want, maybe go a different direction. But at the same time, I think it's still worth having the conversation about reaching out, talking to people about this. If you have a particular idea, if you think something, well, this just absolutely fits my story, and I want to tell a story about this locality. I want to tell this story about the people that have lived here, and this is important. And including that First Nations perspective is important, then I think doing the work. Don't be afraid to do the work either. And I mean, the work may not come out the way you think it's going to, but that's okay. I think having that conversation is, rather than freezing up and going a different direction because it's safer, I think, having that conversation is important. I think that may be kind of like a next step. It's one thing to it's a good thing to recognize the importance of cultural properties. But I think, I mean, if we don't have those conversations and we just kind of freeze up, it does those cultures a disservice, I think, as well. I mean, why can't they be involved? Or why can't we see them as part of the greater human cultural milieu?
Hmm. And I'm just looking at the chat here, and it's someone, Neanderthal, said something about an expansion on ghosts. How about, because ghosts, spirits, that's universal throughout all culture, all different types of culture.
Oh yeah, ghosts are
But
great.
Yeah,
You can always use a ghost.
yeah, and they're more malleable. But I think because people recognize what a ghost is, but every culture has their own way to repel or ward off a ghost, which I think would be very interesting to show to the players. Um, you can show it to your players as well. So I guess maybe go into more specific type of ghosts, because I know the yokai. The yokai is another different set encyclopedia of different of different creatures, and I'm not expert myself, but I guess perhaps we can discuss more about, like, what are the cultures that you're more familiar with? How do they deal with a ghost, perhaps, because there's other ways to ward them off other than up some sage or something you see in paranormal shows where they just use sage around or something. Since ghost is a very universal thing that's available in all culture.
Okay, so I'll start. Um, as I mentioned, so on Brazil, and just say when I say on Brazil, it's kind of complicated because Brazil is a fucking huge country. So sometimes one thing that it was common on my region, it's not common on another. So just to be very first of all clear about that, but it's kind of interesting that yes, we have some ghost stories, some kind of ghost things. The most commons, and I think that that's kind of almost universal, is something like a white lady or something like that. Normally a woman that died on their day that they were marrying or something like that, and they are always with their dresses and trying to find maybe a new groom for her wedding, maybe on that and this kind of thing. But it's very interesting that normally that stories does not tell how you defeat her or how you banish her or how you handle with these kind of creatures, which again could be interesting because that just gave the GM kind of quite a lot of freedom to kind of came up with several kind of ideas. The other common ghosts that again I think that would be kind of universal. It's the ghosts that are normally haunting a specific place for some specific reason. Maybe it's where they were killed, or maybe that's where the people that they love were leaving, or something like that, and they are kind of tied to a place and not exactly to themselves on that place. It's on the place itself. So the person here on the chat mentioned about the manor house or the cemetery, or maybe if you're going for the Vaesen idea, maybe some kind of old factory that it's not being used anymore, and this kind of thing. So it depends on where you want to put. You basically can put a ghost anywhere, and by the perspective of the game, ghosts can still be a Vaesen. They are still considered a Vaesen.
I will bring up. I hope I'm not talking too much, but I will bring up. I think I have kind of two ideas I want to put to you here. Two different perspectives, kind of opposite ends of the spectrum that you could do with ghosts. The first is a ghost story is a very personal thing. It carries with it a lot of emotional weight. It carries with it a lot of history. It carries with it a lot of baggage. Um, Common ghost story in Newfoundland is the drowned sailor. And oftentimes it's the story of a sailor who makes an ill-advised promise on the family crucifix to that if he dies at sea, that he will come back and let his beloved know what happened to him. And of course, this is an ill-advised promise on a crucifix. Grandma faints. It's the whole thing, and then he does die at sea. And the last we ever see of his beloved is her screaming as he carries her away down the street toward the ocean to drown with him. Full of emotion, and oftentimes these stories, there's actually a great storyteller here named Dale Jarvis. He has about 3 or 4 books on Newfoundland ghost stories and hauntings specifically. I think he's coming out with one on haunted houses soon. So that's one where it's the ghosts have they have the names of the people involved in the ghost stories and what street they lived on and everything. Very specific. The other thing, the other direction, on the other hand, you could go with it. The best book I've read this year is Alison Rumfitt's Tell Me I'm Worthless. This is a ghost story about a house that literally becomes fascist because of haunting. The ghosts that live inside of it have compounded and basically gelled into turning this house into a haunted organism. So that's another direction you could go. You could have ghosts stacked on top of ghosts, stacked on top of ghosts. You could go so many different directions with this. And yeah, those are just kind of the two approaches that I've seen recently that strike me. You could go so many different ways, or something kind of in between.
And just in addition to that, because ghosts, every culture has them. You can even, because ghosts is so malleable as a Vaesen, as Stephen has pointed out, it could be quite personal. And you can even use the ghost as to tell a lot about the region that you have your uh, scenario set in. So maybe it's not haunting a factory somewhere in London. You can have it maybe have a ghost haunting maybe a rice field somewhere, and for some reason, and then unfortunately happens to be a body underneath the rice field. Yada yada yada. So it's all about, like, when it comes to using ghosts, at least how I will use it as, it's a way to show off the setting that you want your players to be exposed to, especially if it's unfamiliar. Um, I mean, that's one direction I would take, and Steven has and Cussa already has talked about ghosts. What about you, Christian, and I forgot your name, Lucas? Lucas, how would you
Uh,
adapt ghosts in the settings that you're familiar with?
in the Greenlandic lore I have been reading, I have it's very very little that have been touched about ghost in the way the European typically see ghost as something haunting. It is more like the ancestors coming back to affect the world as of now. And I'm not an expert on how to remove them, but it's just, when I read my sources, the gist I get is the shaman, the spirit shaman in the villages will go into some kind of trance to communicate with the spirit world, to make the ancestors pass over, or to relay the message the ancestor is trying to get over the board. Uh, I, when I in my sources, it don't seem that the traditional ghost is a bad thing. Is in Greenlandic lore. The bad ghost is more like the elemental ghost and elemental spirits. So I don't think I have so much to to bring to this the ghosty thing.
Yeah, in Appalachia, it's much more similar to Newfoundland, and that sort of intensely personal, um, sort of unfinished business, is kind of the prevailing theme of ghosts. That they are, yeah, that it's a very personal thing. It's often that woman in white trope, that is, and you know, you're landlocked, so you don't have drowning sailors, but you do have people dying uh of unnatural causes.
Like you fall
Um,
down a coal shaft real easy. That's practically
exactly.
drowning in darkness.
Yeah, falling off a mountain. Uh, you get like these sort of sudden death uh lead to hauntings by spirits with unfinished business. And the primary way to get rid of them is to help them finish their business. Um, it's not so much a warding off; it's a how do you figure out what they need to accomplish, and then accomplish that, in order to let them pass on. Um, the other cool ghost story from Appalachia is uh, the origin is the Grim, which is a large black dog figure, which was widely seen as what happens if you bury your family's dog with you, like when if the family dog dies, or if you bury your dog with like a grandparent who has died, that dog will then come back and haunt your family because it did not want to be buried. Um, which is a kind of particular form of ghost, but is very distinctly still like considered a ghost haunting, an animal ghost.
There is a movie with that thematic. Uh, Fluck. That's the name of the movie, I think. It's exactly that. That that is he dies and he doesn't feel prepared to go to to the other side, and basically he came back as a dog to stay with his family.
Actually, that's interesting thing to point out about like movies, because of course when making scenarios we look to inspiration not only from books and stories but also film. Can any of you think of perhaps a good example and how this movie was able to adapt the folklore that you want to set your scenario in? Like example, like Brazilian horror, folklore horror. Uh, I know for a fact that if you look specifically at South Asian horror, all of it, nearly all of it, Southeast Asian horror, all of it is folklore. It's very localized. Even some that has not been translated yet. That my mom used to listen to through radio dramas. Can any of you think of perhaps if there's any Greenland folklore or horror out there, or examples of Newfoundland or whichever? Because that's always a good starting point for GMs to see like how were they able to do it, and maybe I can see how I can utilize what I see into my scenario. Are there examples, if any? Because some of the folklore are not as popular as others, unfortunately.
I would like to, but I don't. I have never heard about it. It should be a thing in. No.
I'm a very recent, no longer scared. So I used to not watch horror, even as recently as a few years ago, and I have only recently been introduced to it by my partner. So I don't have a very wide range of horror movie knowledge. So also no.
There's something out there right now. I'm not familiar with it, but I just looked it up out of curiosity. It's a folk horror piece called The King Tide, which may
Never heard of
be.
it.
Yeah, no, it's like I think it was kind of an indie film that was released in according to this, it would be April of 2024. Um, Canada has kind of a curious film industry in that there's a lot of help for kind of local independent projects. Certainly, Newfoundland has had has its fair share of kind of films that have been filmed here. It's kind of recently opened itself up. The newer rendition of Peter Pan was filmed here, for example. But I mean specifically to kind of Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada, I think that this would be kind of a direction to go, sort of a folk horror. Um, Trying to think that if there are others that are worth mentioning at this point. I don't know. The Black Dog talk got me immediately thinking about not a film but a documentary about the pyramid at Sequoia and how they found a temple of Bast there that was full of hundreds, like a dump truck full of mummified cats.
Oh,
Completely unrelated, but it just kind of blew my mind.
oh no,
I
no,
thought
it's
about that
fine.
image and kind of like not wanting to be buried. What would a dump truck full of hundreds of cats, or a dump truck worth of mummified cats be thinking if they were ghosts? And
Oh,
how would they terrify, archaeologists working in the late 1800s? That sort of it immediately kind of put me in mind there.
There would be nothing left on the table. Everything will be laying on the floor.
That would be the first night, and the second night there'd be nothing left of anybody's insides. But
Yeah.
yeah, no, I get what you're saying.
that just reminds me of the story of the Cats of Ulthar, the Lovecraft
Wow.
story, and he loves cats. And well, we won't talk about the name that he gave a cat, but the Cats of Ulthar is what reminded me of just a bunch of cats. Well, you did something to us. Well, you're gonna get something back. Or,
Yeah.
yeah, and I mean, I enjoy horror films, so that's why I bring it up. But it's unfortunate that there's not a lot of folklore horror that is not available, especially when, of course, there is,
Horror is
a
definitely
language barrier to
growing as
be.
a genre. Sorry, I didn't
Oh,
mean to interrupt you
no,
there.
no, no, it's no problem. You want to add more?
I was
Sorry.
just going to say, folk horror is growing as a genre,
Mhm.
and definitely, I mean, there are things that you could adapt cross-culturally. I think that, I mean, if you were to look at like some of the more classic ones, I mean, if you were to look at like Blood on Satan's Claw and stuff like that, those are the ones from, I think it's from the 70s. I mean, that is a folk horror that could easily turn up in any kind of European colony. You could definitely but I mean, as far as like direct adaptations of the locations that we're specifically interested in, I can't think of much. But I mean, you can go to the folk horror canon and dig up things. I mean, Blood on Satan's Claw is one. The Witchfinder General, maybe less so, but the what is the one where they trap him and they set him on fire?
You mean the Wicker Man?
Yeah, the original Wicker Man. I mean,
I
kind
like
of.
how you stated the original,
Yeah,
not the other one.
Yeah, no. Christopher Lee as Lord Summerisle was definitely the. He's quite the villain there. But yeah, the idea, and especially, I think now I'm actually getting on a train of thought. I apologize here for taking up so much time. But the idea, diaspora, the idea that when people move away from home, they take their culture with them, and actually their culture becomes more important when they're away. The people who are more likely to celebrate being Newfoundlanders are the people that are living in Alberta right now, working the oil fields. You know, they're because I mean because they miss home, and so how do you miss home? You practice your folk beliefs, and so in that way, I mean, if you were to I mean, maybe you have people who live far away from kind of where their call it pagan roots are, for their pagan festivals are, but they could be practicing them a lot more hardcore in the new world because they want to remember who they are and they want to cling to who they are in that way that diaspora do.
Oh, that's a good point to bring up because it's cultural identity, and since Vaesen said in 19th century, there's importance in that, and of course there is the theme of uh, let's say industrialization, progression, which unfortunately it's something you can play off of that can't be stopped. While people who are moving, that's right, they do cling to their beliefs and their culture because that's who they are. They don't want to lose their cultural identity. And I think that's also themes you can play with when it comes to, let's say, adapting Vaesen for different settings, um, especially with people moving around. I think that's a very good point to bring up the diaspora. That's the right term for it. You can tell lots of interesting stories with that, and it depends on what type of story that you all want to tell in your scenarios. So that's a good point. That's very interesting. Um, well, let's see here. Uh, let's see if there's any more. Well, someone commented ghost cats nightmarish. Yes, that could be that they are. That's a quite nightmarish thought. I'm just
Ghost
trying to
mummy
think
cats.
about her mummy cats. But
Just
when it
one
comes,
other thought that I did have, which is it's
go
something
for
that's
go
been
for it.
kind of growing around in my head. I apologize, but the idea that, especially with kind of coming to the new world, that idea, or coming or immigrating collectively, you know, I just picture the fact that you would have kind of the people getting off the boats in New York Harbor and having their papers checked and having their identities confirmed and all of that. And then just underneath the harbor, you have all the line of Vaesen that are getting, their passports checked and their names written down and like, okay, no, you can move to this neighborhood, that sort of thing. I picture like somebody with the sight just kind of maybe being drunk one night, seeing this in New York Harbor, seeing like the lights of the boats and all of that, and then looking and seeing this whole secondary line of immigrating Vaesen, just as something to torment them with.
And I can imagine that happening in because we're talking about, at least when it comes to the Wild West, you have people traveling out west and taking their beliefs with them, and the Vaesen are traveling with them
Fairies
as
in their little
well.
covered wagons. Yeah.
I,
That would be called the Oregon Trail, not the Oregon Trail.
I just got a thought about when we see in other systems, we see the same thing look different, like in Pokemon. We have the standard edition, and we have the Aloha. I think it's pronounced edition. It could just as well be with Vesen. It could be that Nissa is blue in Africa or South America or whatever. It is the same, but have special traits. Who is affected by the region they are found in, because they have had to adapt.
I'm sorry. When I think of blue little people, I think of Smurfs. So please forgive me.
They're living in Belgium. Uh,
How
They should
miserable would the Ash wife be if she has to become like a Savara wife, if she has to suddenly live in a cactus?
Oh, I love that idea. Like a Shogaro wife, you
and
disturb a
and be
cactus.
and be envious on her cousin living in a baobab tree.
Oh,
Like
Yeah, but
Redwood.
that does, in all seriousness, though, that does kind of bring the point I do like that idea that the environment that these Vaesen are immigrating to can change them. And I think, and I mean, in some ways, they might forget themselves. They might develop new ideas. I was thinking about this in terms of folklore in Newfoundland. Over here, there's references to being taken by the fairies, to being fairy shot, to being switched at birth by the fairies, but there's no kind of proper names for them. They're not called the she or anything like that, even though there's kind of there's a large Irish population here. The old names that you might find in Ireland have gone, and they've just been replaced with this kind of uniform, the fairies. It strikes me that yeah, you might get populations of Vaesen that are homogenized, that are changed somehow, that take on new characteristics that even, adapt poorly. I mean, there are no nice fairies in Newfoundland, as far as I know. I have yet to come across a single story of one. They are not kind here.
and
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 in many ways, that reflects the fact that this island was not kind to the people who came here. It beat them up, it was ruthless to them.
and just as example, the Danish ferries isn't normally small. It is more like the big ones from Lord of the Rings. The only history I know about elves in Danish folklore is working with the elf king to dance unfortunate men to death in the in Bugfork in the midnight sun, um, and dance them to death. That's the Danish fairies. We don't have not really have pixies and like that. So in somewhere the same creature have changed from either from the Irish law about small pixies to Danish to be something else, or the other way. But some way it is called the same creature and in parts the same creature, but it look different, act different.
um, Cussa, is there any example of, well, fairies in Brazil that you might know of? Because the thing of like hidden folk, or little people or with wings, you get to see them almost overall or adapted in different environments. Just wondering if there is something like that.
The we have some things, but they are very different on the perspective that the idea of fairies, at least looking from this perspective, looks quite European. Let me put this way. On Brazil, maybe because of the country that it was with a lot of forests on the past and this kind of thing. Most of the similar things that we'll have, it's our kind of spirits from the forest. They are kind of very different from the concept that we have from fairies. So, for example, we would have the kind of curupira that is a kind of, the protector of the forest. So he has his pass is turned side to the back. So basically, when he's trying to escape, people are thinking that he's running to one place and he's running to another. He has the hair on fire. He kind of knows how to use the errand bow, and he's kind of just killing the people that are coming to try to destroy the trees and this kind of thing. So it's a kind of more wild version of fairies on this perspective. Of course, that I know that there are some kind of part of fairy tales that are not exactly fairish. They are quite wild, but on this common perspective that people are normally thinking about fairies, Brazil goes in a kind of crazy wild way. So it's more like spirits from the forest that are normally related to that. So big snakes, and this kind of thing.
I wouldn't want to run into that, the fairy. But no. What about you, Lucas? Is there any examples like that in Appalachia?
Yeah, there's definitely a belief in fairies, and again, like Stephen, I think it's a very reflective of kind of the hostile nature. So fairies are often uh, trying to lure people off of the beaten track in the woods. Um, uh, Dancing lights in the forest, just out of just over that hill, until you're hopelessly lost and dying in the woods. Um, so there certainly is a fairy tradition. Um, there's not a super strong delineation. Like there are certain creatures in Appalachia um, that are described by name, but they're not really seen as fae. Um, and the fairy culture is more focused on this sort of luring temptation idea to lure you out into the wilderness, um, away from civilization.
And with Basin, there's always this theme of nature versus industry. And it makes sense that these creatures of the environment, the natural environment, will be quite hostile. Um, because I only can think of one example. They're kind of considered to be dwarves. They're small people in the Philippines called the duende. They are invisible, but when you're passing by what you think is supposedly their home, you basically say "excuse me, dabi dabi po," and pass by. It kind of reflects how we should be respectful to that environment. If you're not, you'll be cursed. If you kick a duende in the head, you'll get a headache, or if you'll get sick, or you'll get like a bruise or something. And that's something that's interesting you can play around with, especially putting in different especially when you're putting base in different environments. You can do you can do many interesting things. Especially imagine maybe someone who's new to the setting, they're not aware of this, and they come up with a problem. Like imagine explorer coming across what you mentioned, Kusa. They're like, okay, how am I gonna deal with this? They're not like the fairies I've seen back home. What am I going to do? And of course, etc., etc. There's many interesting things you can do with Invasion in regards to setting it in different settings. Um, hmm. I don't know what else to add. We kind of went over. Actually, there's one thing. Because one of you mentioned that you have expertise on. Was it you, Stephen, that you also involved? Like, it's Newfoundland and Canada, right? As well, you
Well,
kind of grouped them together.
yeah. No, I think I mentioned previously that I went to Necronomicon recently. It's one of the conventions I attend in person, and there was a wonderful Canadian horror panel on Canadian horror literature and kind of the current state of the genre in Canada. And so sort of talking about there was a lot of discussion about kind of the nature of Canada and kind of what is Canada vis-a-vis horror. And I think that And of course, this was a Lovecraftian convention, so I mean, we were looking at it from a Lovecraftian perspective. But the two things that really kind of came across to me that I thought were very interesting. One was that you can still imagine that there are places in Canada and indeed other parts of the world that even to this day, I mean, humans have not set foot. There are places that are very remote. In Canada, you look south because there's nothing going on to the north of you. Nothing you want to see anyway. And the other thing that kind of grabbed me as interesting and I thought was a very kind of Canadian perspective was the idea that Canadians, and indeed, well, I mean, you could say this to the US, although it's definitely feeling more fractured where I used to live. Canadians are very much a patchwork people. We're a hybrid people, at least according to some of the best horror writers in the country right now. And that hybridization, that kind of I am not just a Newfoundlander but a Canadian, or I am a French Canadian, I am a Quebecois, and then I'm Canadian. I am a Montrealais, I am a Quebecois, I am a Canadian. Those sort of ideas are those are where kind of the strength is. That's where kind of I mean, as much as tying this back to Vaesen, as much as Vaesen doesn't kind of want to imply morality for either the supernatural or human beings, I mean, the sort of the positive morality in Canada is the idea that we are a hybrid people. Whereas the negative side of morality, the darker kind of aspects of it, that pushes you to try and be a pure person. The idea that you are one thing distinctly and you are not part of other groups. I hope I made sense in saying that. I don't think I quite translated the words of those authors as well as I could, but the idea that the idea that well, again, this would be going back to Lovecraft. If you look at like a story like The Shadow over Innsmouth, the hybrid was what Lovecraft feared, whereas the pure was his protagonist. In Canada, we would see the hybrid as being the protagonist place. The hybrid is the positive morality, the desire to be pure, to be one thing, and to be kind of distinct from others would be the negative. Again, I hope I make sense in that. It's kind of that's a very broad concept in horror, but that's kind of what I took from that panel that I attended.
I think those themes do does align with the themes in Vaesen, which is of course industrialization versus nature, of course, progressivism and such like that. Especially when you have people's moving around and have to occupy the same space, whether they like it or not. Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's
And
the thing. An immigrant community is a community that has to hybridize. I mean, if you look at a place like, what was New York City like in 1880? It was a hybrid place. It was a place of dozens of different cultures trying to live together. And yeah, I see skepticism on your face there now. I'm just curious. Or are you wondering
no.
what I'm talking about?
No, I just imagine that I think that would be an interesting setting for Vaesen, only because I've been in New York City. New York is such it's a mosaic of neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And imagine if different types of Vaesen crawling around in specific neighborhoods, you got yourself kind of like a hodgepodge or a melting pot of Vaesen that I really don't know how the society members are going to combat that, because there's so many Vaesen they would have to deal with, talk with, if they are reasoned with. Some Vaesen can't be reasoned with, etc., etc. So that's just basically the first thought in my head. And I can imagine that could be the same.
Piles of ghosts on top of that. Actually, CJ had a great idea. I'll refer back to CJ's point from last night on a panel that I moderated. The idea that you could find horror in a disagreement between two people or two households, and their accompanying Vaesen. You know, maybe you have a situation where, I mean, a lot of Vaesen are indifferent to human beings, but some might pick sides. Some might say, "This is my human. I'm going to help them," whether they want it or not.
Yeah, that's right. We only have like at least 7 minutes left. Is there anything else that you want to add or whatnot, or add or whatnot to those who are watching the panel before we take off?
I have some things that I separated before I came, and with this idea about adapting Vaesen, and I mentioned already some things here, but there is three things that I want to put. So as I mentioned, looking to the context of the place that you are looking, and if we're bringing everything that we talked here today, of course that people will be bringing not only their Vaesen, but even kind of some part of religion, and you can create some myths came from that mix of religion. So for example, we have in Brazil one myth that is basically the kind of headless mule, that is basically a kind of a cursed woman because she had sex with priests. And if you look, for example, on Brazil, where we have a population that were not Christianized, and then there is some kind of priests coming here, and the natives didn't have any kind of problem to have sex with the priests. So how you kind of try to make something, to try to scare them, so you can create a myth that they will be cursed, and it's very easy, for example, to remove a head's horse and say that, yeah, that was that woman that disappeared 2 days ago because she had sex with this priest. So yeah, something like that. So this is one thing that you can take inspiration. That's why I'm just bringing these ideas here. The second one that I want to mention is exactly looking for the industrialization thing and how that can be helping this thing. Uh, you know, how people can try to create some kind of invisible gates to try to protect their thing. On Brazil, we had quite some gold extraction. People were kind of going to South America because of the gold, the silver on Argentina. And for example, there is some myth that we have there. There is something like the mother of gold. That the idea is that, oh, this is a kind of spirit that protect the gold mines. And the reality is that if you see that, you'll die automatically. There is no description for this creature because, if you see that, you died. So nobody came back to tell how was that kind of spirit. So if you take exactly this idea, for example, and maybe there is no Vaesen for kind of protecting the industry, but maybe because people are starting to believe that there is a Vaesen protecting the industry, a Vaesen starts to appear protecting the industry. So you can even have this kind of, totally reverse engineer idea of the Vaesen to bring something totally different. And the third one is some of the myths are kind of just to try to explain the unexplainable. And in Brazil, for example, we have a very interesting one that is the story about the boto, or it's a kind of enchanted dolphin. That the story is that it's a kind of a very beautiful man that appears on the night, go to the parties, seduce the young ladies, impregnate them, and then go back to the river as a dolphin and go away. And that's how that poor women were kind of get pregnant, and their child never met the father. So anything that there is no reasonable explanation could generate some kind of myth. So if you are kind of taking, again, I'm using the Brazilian um, version of this Vaesen just because it's from where I come. But if you take these ideas and you put to anywhere, you can create any number of any kind of Vaesens and really surprise your players.
Yeah. Anyone else like that? No, that's a good point. Basically, you can create anything, any type of Vaesen.
And now I'm scared of dolphins.
Yeah, I can't look at dolphins the same way.
Or donkeys.
Or donkeys. Anyone else before, or even last words before we close off? I'm gonna see. There's no questions in the chat. I'll say that this was an interesting. It's my first time moderating the panel, so please excuse me. Any feedback would be appreciated. But it was quite fascinating to hear what all of you know about this folklore. I know nothing about these. Now I need to maybe buy more books that I have no space for. Because I'm always looking for something pretty new. All I can say is that when it comes to adapting Vaesen, is that keep an open mind. Of course, be respectful to the source material, and at the same time, just have fun. Tell a good story, and I think that's what all of us would like to have our players experience an amazing story. I think that's a good way to close. I think. Anything else before we go? Other than a hand wave saying bye. All right. Bye. Yeah. All right.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.
Take care.